Good afternoon, everyone. I'm very glad to open this next panel on a key aspect when dealing with collections from colonial context. Return is another very relevant area of activity defined in the framework principles for dealing with collections from colonial context in Germany. The framework principles highlight the relevance of identifying cultural objects from colonial contexts which were appropriated in a way which is no longer legally or ethically justifiable. Enabling the return is then a moral and ethical obligation, but also an important political task, especially in the case of human remains. The aim of the following panel on the topic of return is to discuss the current political, ethical, and legal challenges for the return of cultural objects from colonial context, and also to identify relevant European and international measures and action models for the return of cultural objects from colonial context. Before I introduce our panel moderator, Professor Hilgert, I would like to remind the audience to send us their questions during the conversation or discussion in the chat. There will be a 45-minute discussion and then 15 minutes for questions from the audience. In case we cannot address these questions during the conference, we will try to do that at a later stage. I would like to introduce now our panel moderator, Professor Dr. Markus Hilgert. Professor Hilgert is a specialist in ancient Near East studies. He served as a director of the Ancient Near East Museum at the Pergamon Museum in Berlin from 2014 until 2018. From 2007 until 2014, he was professor for Ancient Near East Studies, Assyriology at the Heidelberg University. At present, Professor Hilgert is Secretary General and CEO of the Cultural Foundation of the German Federal States, and he is also the director of the German Contact Point for Collections from Colonial Context. Professor Hilgert is also a member of several governing bodies and advisory boards, including the board of the German Commission for UNESCO, the Foundation Board of the International Alliance for the Protection of Heritage in Conflict Areas, ALIF, the advisory board of the Arcadia Fund, and the advisory group of the Cultural Protection Fund of the British Council. And he holds honorary professorships at the Heidelberg Universität, Marburg University, and Berlin Freie University. Professor Hilgert, we are very honored and glad to have you here. Welcome back. The floor is yours.
Thank you very much, Maria Paris, for your kind introduction. Good afternoon, everybody. Welcome back to our conference of the German Contact Point. I'm very pleased and honored to talk with distinguished scholars and distinguished guests about the topic of return, which obviously is one of the central topics and also one of the central areas of activity in the German framework principles. Before we start our discussion, it's my pleasure to introduce the panelists to you, and I'll go in alphabetical order. First, it is my pleasure to introduce to you Professor Dr. Ines de Castro, who since 2010 has been the director of the Linden-Museum in Stuttgart, the State Museum of Anthropology, which is one of the important, if not to say one of the most important ethnographic collections of Europe. Professor de Castro, together with her team, has experimented with different forms of participation with communities based both locally and abroad for exhibition and research projects. The Linden Museum notably is also working on new ways to deal with the colonial heritage and with its colonial collections and with the entangled history between Europe and the places of origin of our collection. Professor de Castro was born in Buenos Aires, Argentina, and she has graduated in anthropology from the University of Bonn in Germany. From 2006 to 2010, she was a curator and deputy director of the ethnographic collection at the Römer and Pelizaeus Museum in the city of Hildesheim. Welcome, Dr. de Castro. I'm very pleased and honored to introduce to you also Herekiekie Herewini, who is, pardon me, is my computer playing tricks on me? I'm sorry, apologies. Again, I would like to introduce to you Mr. Herekiekie Herewini, whose Maori ancestry is connected to Maori tribes associated with the following tribal confederations, including Kura Haupo, Te Arawa, Aotea, Tainui, Ngato Kimatavuora, and Te Kaumaunga. I'm sorry, Mr. Herewini, if I'm not pronouncing these names correctly. However, also Te Herekieke's European ancestry includes ancestors from Prussia, now Germany, the United Kingdom, Spain, and Switzerland. Te Herekiekie began working at the Museum of New Zealand Te Papa Tongarewa in October 2007 and is tasked with facilitating the repatriation of Maori and Moriori ancestral remains housed in international institutions. As head of repatriation, he leads the program's strategic direction and implements key strategies. Welcome to our panel, Te Herekiekie. It is my pleasure also to introduce to you Mr. Alexander Herman, who is the Assistant Director of the UK-based Institute of Art and Law, IAL. Alexander Herman worked in Canada as a lawyer, then in London for Norman Palmer on leading art law and cultural property cases involving the Parthenon marbles and art export disputes, among others. He now teaches and oversees the educational offerings of the IAL. He's a co-founder and current program co-director of the Art, Business and Law Masters at the Center for Commercial Law Studies at Queen Mary University of London. Mr. Herman is currently leading the team at the IAL that was awarded the contract by the Arts Council England to draft new guidance for UK museums on restitution and repatriation. Thank you very much for agreeing to be on our panel this afternoon. And finally, it is my great pleasure to introduce to you Dr. Hadji Malick Ndiaye. Dr. Ndiaye has a doctorate in art history from the University of Rennes. He's also a graduate student of the Institut National du Patrimoine and is a former fellow of the Institut National d'Histoire de l'Art. Currently, Dr. Ndiaye is a researcher at the Institut Fondamental d'Afrique Noire in Dakar, Senegal, where he is a member of the administrative board and president of the Scientific Commission. He is also a curator of the Théodore Monod Museum of African Art and IFAN, Secretary General of ICOM, the ICOM National Committee of Senegal, and a member of the board of the Art Council of African Studies Association. Dr. Ndiaye is a member of the Orientation Committee of the 2018 edition of the Dakar Biennale, and he is the Artistic Director of the Biennale of Contemporary African Art 2020, which obviously will be in a postponed edition. Dr. Ndiaye teaches art history and cultural heritage, collaborates with several magazines, and participates in various international scientific activities. A theorist and curator, his publications focus on modern and contemporary art and global history, cultural policies, and African museum institutions. Dr. Ndiaye, thank you very much for being on our panel this afternoon. Return is probably one of the questions that when we talk about dealing with the colonial era and the colonial injustices provokes more emotions than other topics do. For example, documentation and transparency that we talked about earlier, or international cooperation that we will talk about later this afternoon. Return is often felt to be a loss by certain stakeholders, but it's considered to be healing by others. And this afternoon, I would very much like to hear from you not only about the meaning of restitution and return. This is probably the question that we could start with, but I would also like to hear from you about your ideas about mechanisms for return. How can we actually achieve return of collections from colonial contexts And last but not least, what are good practices of return? And I know that all of you have been involved in actually returning human remains and objects from colonial contexts to their countries and societies of origin. So I would very much like to focus on the meaning, on mechanisms, and also on good or best practice. And if you allow, I would like to start with you, Dr. Ndiaye, and would like to ask you what for you the meaning of return is.
Thank you so much, Dr. Markus Hilgert, and thank you for the invitation. And I would like to say hello, everybody, and thank you also to join us. For the first question, I maybe would like to remind that the question of restitution or return, it's up to you. I will talk about it later. But this question is very important for African countries, especially those who lost a very big part of their history. Because in this object, we have locked our identity, we have locked our memory. Those objects are not only objects, those objects are open books. Those objects are part of what we used to do in the past, and that will help us to build economical, cultural, identical development. And these objects are very important also for this nation because they help to build a global national identity. In the scientific level also, these objects are very important because they help us to rewrite our history and to know more about all the technical and technical thing we used to do. Some these technical things are very scientific also, and they help us, me particularly and my student, to rebuild our history. But it is very important because this object will help us to rewrite history. And when I say rewriting our history, is that we do it in go back and go ahead and go back between us and the others. I don't know if you understand what I mean. It will be in a dialogue, and in this dialogue we must not deny the very part of history that was played by European country in Africa in the time that the object was stolen. And that's why I will focus on the term of return and restitution, because in this process we must have respect if we would like to have a very big process of return or restitution. We must have respect of the history. And that's why I don't like the term return only. I would like to focus on the term of restitution. Why? Because, restitution means that you give back to the rightful owner something that was taken illegally, and sometimes in a historical condition that was very cruel in this context. But the term return does not necessarily take into account the notion of belonging, which is contained in this term of restitution. This is, and that's why I would like to remind the first speech of Emmanuel Macron, when he said that he will do all the things he can do in order to make temporary or definitive restitution of the African heritage content in the French museum. I'm not a lawyer. I discussed with many colleagues, jurists, lawyer, and they French lawyer, and they explain that they don't know what the notion of temporary restitution means, because restitution is always definitive. What I would like to underline here is that if you focus only on restitution, it means that two things, probably. It means that we deny the part of, thing and horrible condition and stolen and, traffic that we do during the colonial order. But in the other hand, we will consider this object only like gift, this object that European country, European museum should return in Africa, in African state, are not gift. That's why the term return for me is not appropriate. And in the process of restitution, we should redefine the terminology we use. For example, I heard many persons calling the museum that are in Africa ethnographic museum. For example, we just have this discussion many times there in Germany and in many other scientific sphere. And we explain that those objects are not, first, there is no ethnographical museum in Africa. It's nonsense. So, because ethnography is a vision. So this other vision can grow up in Germany, for example, or in French. So they can say that, okay, they have ethnographical museum because it is this kind of category fit in their, kind of reading the world. But in Africa, we cannot have this kind of ethnographic museum because those objects, as Siraj Rasool say, were ethnographicized, but are not ethnographic objects. We just must to be careful in this process to redefine, to use the right word, and to redefine this terminology. Because European country and African country should take the occasion of this process of restitution in order to make a rebalancing of relationship between their states, because history was not equilibrium, in the same level. So, and we must take the occasion of culture to pose the challenge in our country, for example, of the importance of museum policy, to deal with our politics, in order they provide our institution with adequate technology. We should also take this occasion to have a new kind of political international relationship. So we redefine this term in the cultural diplomacy in order to have new relation. Yes, and we should also make a revision. Yes, a revision of all the terms we use in the context of the restitution, because this question is very important. This question is very crucial for the development and for the future, and that's why the scientific aspect should be the first thing we should put on the table before going ahead. And yes, okay. The first word I can say is that.
Thank you very much, Dr. Ndiaye, for this beautiful panorama of what restitution means and what it implies. And I was very moved about your statement that you need cultural objects to rewrite history. I think it's also important to talk about the epistemologies that you were referring to, redetermining, redefining the museum, not only in Europe, but also in Africa, and also talking about cultural diplomacy. So I think we have a whole set of questions and ramifications that we will be talking about later. I would also like to come back later to your statement that you think we need to think more clearly and more intensely about return and restitution and what terminology we use. And I think we should come back to that in a minute. Before I do that, I would like to ask Herekiekie, Herewini, what for him return restitution means, both personally and also as a scholar and a practitioner.
Kia ora koutou. Good morning, everyone. Such a privilege, like the previous speaker, to be on this panel, and just want to acknowledge you, Professor Dr. Markus Hilgert, and all the other panelists. Kia ora, greetings from the South Pacific. As you may know, the South Pacific was one of the last areas to be colonized by human beings. And so when my ancestors came into the Pacific 3,000 years ago, there were no other people on these islands that we came to, particularly the ones in Polynesia. We were the first people here. And part of what our ancestors did is we had a desire to explore, to understand the world, and to understand the world both physically and spiritually. And so if we take that understanding, when Europeans actually started coming into the South Pacific, and particularly New Zealand, and the first European was Abel Tasman in the 1600s. He actually didn't land on our country. But then after that, Captain Cook came in 1769. And so those engagements with the local people, the indigenous people, the Maori people, the tribes around the country, was really around a lot of misunderstanding, but also it was around two different groups of humans trying to understand each other. So when my understanding of my ancestors is the great desire to understand what was beyond our country, to understand what was out there and to explore, because in our traditional culture, there has always been that desire to understand what is beyond the horizon and to explore and to understand other human beings. When Europeans came to our country, to our part of the world, they saw us in a different light. They saw us as indigenous people, they saw us as native people, they put us into a hierarchy of where it was possible to own us. And so even though I work in a museum, our experience for my people of being in museums has been of people that as artifacts on display, as human skeletons on display. And it's only been very recent that Maori people have actively been working within a museum in a management position, in positions where we have actually some influence and not just an item on display. So that's only been in the last 50 years. So from the time when Europeans first came to our part of the Pacific, right up to 50 years ago, we were still seen as an object to be owned, as a body that could be controlled. And so it's only been very recent in the from the European point of view that, well, actually, because there are still ancestors in these museums in Europe, but also in America, South America, there is still that understanding that Europeans or Western countries can own indigenous bodies because our ancestors are still there. So that's the first thing, is understanding our own history as people of the Pacific, but also understanding our history as people of Europe, and how that engagement actually, that deep philosophy within Europe from the 1400s allowed the trade of indigenous remains, but also allowed the trade of people from Africa into slavery. So part of that is acknowledging that. When it comes to repatriation, I work in a privileged position where our country, the New Zealand government, actually resources us as a program to repatriate our ancestors. So the group of indigenous people I belong to, we were in a privileged position of having the resources to actually seek the return of our ancestors. And there's three aspects of repatriation that I like to concentrate on. One is the physical return, repatriation. The other is restitution. And the final aspect is reconciliation. And all those aspects, for me, are required to happen, but they all don't happen at the same time. And so the physical return of our ancestors, in one respect, allows institutions to hand over the ancestors. The restitution doesn't necessarily happen at that time, and neither does the reconciliation. And those aspects actually need to be engaged in a long-term project, not necessarily with European institutions, but within institutions within New Zealand, and when we return the ancestors back to their communities and their tribal groups. So part of the work is for European institutions or institutions outside New Zealand to actually open their doors for our ancestors to come home. And so we believe that that's a partnership that we take with institutions overseas. And there's genuine goodwill from many managers, directors, governments, local governments in returning ancestral remains. And so, and that's been throughout Europe. And I think maybe that's enough for me at the moment. I think I've said enough, but it is around relying on goodwill within European countries, and also goodwill of governments and goodwill of institutions.
Thank you very much for this, which contained a lot of important aspects, and also aspects that we need to hear when we discuss, for example, the return, the restitution of human remains, because we all need to think of human remains as being ancestors of people. And I think for us, this is extremely important to widen our discussion and to understand the human side of it and the moral dimension this has. Also, I think it's important to understand that what we're aiming at is reconciliation. And I agree with you that this is a long way to go still. And it will take many difficult steps, but it's certainly something that we're aiming for, and that this initiative also is about. Thank you again. And I would like to turn to Professor de Castro, and I would like to pose to you the same questions that I posed to our two colleagues. What does return and restitution mean to you personally, and as a director of a collection who's actually effected returns very recently?
Yeah, thank you very much. I'm very happy to be here and to share my thoughts with you. I think that from the perspective of an ethnographic museum, we surely have the responsibility to come to terms with our colonial past. We have to look on our colonial past, because ethnographic museums have been created following colonial terms, and in this very deep separation between Europe and the rest of the world. And we also for sure use a lot of colonial structures and power to assemble part of our collection. So I think for me, this is a way to deal with our responsibility and also to create long-lasting partnerships with different communities worldwide. I see restitution really as part of healing, of creating trust one another, also as basis for dialogue, for projects, for projects that where we can learn from each other. And this is the important part for me. I think that this responsibility is very important for museums, and I'm really glad that we get support from our stakeholders.
Sorry, thank you so much for your statement, and we'll come back later to you, Professor de Castro, when we talk about mechanisms or good practice in this area. And I would like to turn to Alexander Herman, because I know that return and restitution is a topic that you're dealing with right now on different levels. And therefore, I would also like to ask you what for you the meaning of return and restitution is, and maybe we can also come back to Dr. Ndiaye's assertion that maybe we should think more carefully about what terminology we use. And I'm actually interested in the approach that the UK is taking right now. Maybe you can say something on that.
Thank you, Professor Hilgert, and it's a great honor to be on this panel with such eminent speakers. I come at it, I suppose, from more of an outsider perspective, but more as a scholar, as an academic, trying to understand the processes at play, and also with a legal background. The way restitution as a term is colloquially used in our sector, meaning the museum sector and the cultural sector at large, is generally understood as return with the ultimate aim of doing justice for a past wrong. So a wrong that was committed maybe historically or maybe more recently. And the intention with the restitution is that the return will cure that, or will do as much as it can to try to cure that historical or past wrong. And so I tend to move outside of the legal definition. I think that the legal definition of restitution, whether under English law or under other systems of law, tends not to be very helpful. I think we need to move beyond law in a sense towards ethics in this area. But that's generally how I would operate with the term restitution. It's an interesting point that Herekiekie raised. I mean, he talked about repatriation, which is a word you hear quite often in English, the return to the patria, or to the fatherland or the homeland. As another term, sometimes used interchangeably with restitution. I'm very sensitive to Dr. Ndiaye's point that restitution is important, and sometimes if we use the term return, it somewhat oversteps the important work of doing justice for the past wrong. We tend to cover that up in a way if we use a term that doesn't engage with it. And I just want to bring to people's attention what's going on currently in the French Parliament, where they're actually engaging in this debate about terminology. So sometimes we could say, oh, these are semantic differences, but actually it's quite an important one in France right now, because as many of you know, there's a bill going through the French Parliament relating to the return of 27 items to Senegal and Benin. And originally that bill used the terminology of restitution, which as Dr. Ndiaye mentioned was the term used by Emmanuel Macron back in 2017. But the French Senate has proposed using the word return, not restitution. And the feeling from the French senators was that restitution related too much to repentance on the part of the French, and they wanted to avoid that. So that's, I think, a very challenging difference that they're working through now in France. So something I think we should all keep an eye on as things progress. That there still is sometimes there is a challenge using the word restitution, and maybe it makes some people a little bit uncomfortable. Doesn't mean we have to avoid the term, but it just means that we do need to have those discussions, and they're happening currently in different parts of the world.
Yes, thank you very much. Excuse me. If I may add that this is the reason, or this is one of the reasons why we decided to use the word return in the framework principles, because we wanted to make sure that we're not tied to a legal framework that in some cases may be too strict. And this is why we chose a term that in our understanding was more neutral, because we also think that it may be important, and this is why we phrased it accordingly in the framework principles, to return on an ethical base and not just on a legal base. This gives us a lot more flexibility also with requests for return, even though we of course acknowledge that what happened at the time was not in line with the ethical principles that we adhere to. So this is the reason, but of course you're right, Dr. Ndiaye, when you point out that we need to think about this as not being something neutral per se. This is done in order to improve or to make good on a past wrong. So in that respect, I absolutely agree. And I think we need to make sure that we're understood correctly when we use certain terms, and that we explain how we use them and what it implies for us. If you allow, I would like to move to the next topic that I'm interested in, which is the mechanisms. So far, we've talked about the frameworks, we've talked about the terminology, and of course, what we're also very interested in is creating mechanisms that allow for an effective return of cultural heritage and human remains from colonial contexts. And Alexander Herman has just reminded us of the French initiative. And I would like to give the word to Ines de Castro now, because in 2019, her museum returned 2 very prominent objects to Namibia. And I would like to ask Professor de Castro what her experience with this return, with this restitution was, what it has meant for her institution, and what she's taken away from it as a take-home lesson, or as something that she may use for further action in this field.
Yeah, thank you very much. I think that the return of the Bible and the whip to Namibia was one of the first examples of returning of cultural goods besides human remains, if we may do this separation. Yeah, I know that many years ago the Namibian ambassador approached the Ministry of Science, Research and Art of the state of Baden-Württemberg with the request to restitute the Bible of the Nama chief Hendrik Witbooi in the name of the Witbooi family. And the Linden-Museum was very interested and supported this request, because we already started in 2016 with provenience research on colonial background. And also we started to look at our Namibian collections that are around 1,500 objects. And clearly coming out from the provenience research, the Bible had been stolen during a German very severe military attack on Hornkranz, the headquarters of Hendrik Witbooi, and according to our documents, together with a whip. So therefore we offered both objects for restitution, and city and state, the legal owners of the collections of the Linden-Museum agreed to support this restitution, so that in October 2018 there was a first trip to Namibia to start negotiations. And towards State Secretary Petra Olszewski, the Witbooi family asked for a restitution of the Bible towards the state of Namibia. So in March of the next year, the handover took place in Gibeon by our State Minister of Science, Research and Art, Theresia Bauer, towards the President of Namibia and very high rank officials. For the museum, I think the important part is not only really that we want to undertake this responsibility, but that we could combine this restitution as or see it as a starting point for a sustainable dialogue project that continues until today. We proposed a project called With Namibia, Engaging the Past, Sharing the Future. And it is now embedded in an initiative that I think is very important from the Ministry of Baden-Württemberg, the Namibia Initiative. And it is a broad partnership program between cultural state institutions of different kind and with Namibian partners. And I think this overall social approach is quite unique in Germany, and it's great because it does not only focus this discussion on the ethnographic museums, but also on other fields of society, as art or archives or school books. Yeah. And perhaps you know that in Germany, really, we also have something that we could, even if it's not comparable, say we also have a kind of loss of memory concerning the colonial times. It seems that really it's not part of our present cultural memory anymore. And so I think it is important, and I see the roles of the museums very prominent in this, to bring this knowledge on colonial times also to a broader society. And this, I think with this initiative of the state, we could really focus on different points. For sure, you asked me about challenges. There were many challenges in this trip. I think this was the first time. We have to learn how to do this, how to address it. For me as a museum director, perhaps an important point is that this Bible and the whip could clearly be attributed to a person or to a family. And so it was much easier to assign to somebody, talking about the rightful owner, who is that, to whom should we give back or restitute. I think that this is rarely the case in our museums. Most objects have been collected without really all this wisdom behind, and without the context. So it is so difficult for us to see who should be really the owner, especially if the restitution concerns, I think, societies that are not represented in the governments of the countries. This is a very difficult discussion or decision for us museums. So I think this is, for example, one challenge that we should go on, and we should see how we can solve it. Another challenge important for me is if we want really to establish this transnational long-lasting partnerships in the core of our museum, as we really want to do, we have to get a closer look on museum structures, on budgetary concerns, on insurance, on housing, on all this was really clear from our experiences that it is not easy to meet the expectations of societies, or the other way around, yeah, from both parts. Yeah, no, I'm not talking only about the societies, but for us, it's difficult with our structures sometimes, with our museum structures, we cannot meet some of the expectations, and the other way around. We want absolutely to avoid a feeling of exploitation of societies. Yeah, we invite them, and then they all talk. They give us all their knowledge, and my question would be: we have to work on what do we give back? Yeah, what is the also on the part of knowledge, what we can offer to also bring them something important. Yeah, perhaps there are difficult and different points. Also, contamination is a point, and other issues. But I leave it for that. Thank you.
Thank you so much, Professor de Castro. I would like to take up one point that you mentioned, and that, of course, is really crucial. To whom do you return? And I would like to ask Herekiekie, Herewini, how you deal with these difficult questions, especially when it comes to human remains. You obviously will not deal with the state because this is a family issue. How do you identify who are the rightful owners, who are the ancestors of whom? Have you found any solutions for this?
Well, we take quite a pragmatic approach to the situation. And so as we go back to our history, our ancestors arrived in our country about 1,000 to 800 years ago. And we were migrants. And the importance or part of our tradition is we understand how we're related to each other. And so our whakapapa, all our genealogies for 800 years, going back even 1,000 years, 2,000 years, are very important to us. And even though we had an oral tradition, it is actually our genealogies that actually pinpoint which parts of the country was our tribal territory, and it's those histories that actually connect us with different parts of the land. And so those genealogies are very important to us. They actually give us access to our history and give us access to relationships with other Māori tribes around the country. The other thing that we have done pragmatically is understanding that when we engage with international institutions, whether they be a museum, a state government, a city council, or a government, is that we understand that they want to know that we come as a group with authority. And part of the authority that we've been able to seek from tribal groups in our country is that they've given permission they've given the mandate for our particular program to speak on all Māori tribal groups and to speak on Moriori tribal groups as well. And we also we've been nominated by the government to actually speak on behalf of the New Zealand government as well. So that is our particular unique, I suppose, template that we have that allows us to actually engage with authority, with institutions outside our country. There was a question, no, I think that's probably enough. Sure.
Thank you very much for this. I'm also looking at the time we're slowly running out of time, but I would like to ask one more question to Dr. Ndiaye that goes back to what Professor de Castro said earlier. She mentioned an example where the restitution of two objects was embedded in a variety of accompanying measures, cooperation between archives, museums, joint research projects. Is this what you would see as good practice when it comes to return, or would you say we need a clear start on more objects to be returned, human remains to be returned before we can start talking about cooperation? Or do you think that when we embark on this road, we should always think about accompanying measures as well?
Thank you. Before answering to this question, I would like to come back a little bit on what is going on. I think that the process we start, it seemed to me that the European country, European Museum, continue to fix the way the discussion of and the process of restitution should go. I think that we should stop and take into account the position and the reflection of African country and professional, because as Dr. Alexander Herman remind us, the French Parliament adopted also the term return. So we go ahead in this process, but the rhythm, the term of the debates are fixed by European country, and we go like the world has never changed. To answer to a question, I would like to focus one thing, which is very important when we talk about the process of restitution too, because as Professor Ines de Castro, we also have a little experience in the same year, 2018. But before giving this example, I would like to mention another point which is very important. In this discussion, we should now begin to take into account that the world has changed, and in Africa we have many great museums that grow up, and that we cannot continue to focus on the capacity of African museum to conserve, to safeguard the object, because the world has changed. The ancient museum like Théodore Museum that I lead began to change, and we have also, in the case of Senegal, new museum like the Museum of Black Civilization, in which many international professional and professor, like one of the George Abungu will be in the next panel, was involved. So it's very important to begin with that. And that's why recently we have this example of restitution of the sabre of Hadji Omar Foutiyou Tall. And in the other way, we have also 27 objects in Benin. In our case, I think that the curator, African curator, never say that all the objects should go back, first thing, because also the objects are cultural ambassador. And we would like that all these objects, some of them continue to represent African culture, African history, and African knowledge. But we should decide us. African country and professional should decide this. It's not the other. We should decide what object must be restituted and what object must be kept as cultural ambassador. It is also a very important point that is important to be, to be underlined in this process. I would like now to answer to this question because, for me, we are in a very long process. And in this in the term of this process, we should have, I think, 80% or 90% of the cultural heritage, African cultural heritage, will come back in Africa for their history, for the knowledge, for everything, and for our university. In 2018, I will focus on an example which is very different from the example we see with the sabre of Hadji Omar and the 27 objects restituted in Benin, because we have the restitution of an object which was stolen maybe in our collection, maybe in 1980s, but not from public institution, but private collector. in Belgium, DJ Class, a private gallery, has restituted this object, and it was so very easy and than the restitution of public institution. And that's why I will finally hand with this. In this process, we should also not focus on only on public institution, but we should also talk about private collection, because many objects go outside of the continent, not during the colonial era, but through traffic and illicit traffic after the independence.
Yes, thank you very much for that. I do agree. I think the topic of illicit trafficking is one that's closely related to what we've been discussing here, and it's something that is going on right now as we speak. We have no more time, but I want to have one short answer from Alexander Herman, just because it's so tempting. We talked about France. You're based in England. Will we see similar actions for return and restitution by British institutions? What do you think?
Well, I don't know if I can speak for either the government or the country as a whole. But what I will say is I think there have been restitutions that have already started. The thing in Britain is that there's a big divide between the national institutions, which usually have fairly strong legal restrictions on deaccessioning items. That doesn't mean that they can't ever restitute, but it just makes the process much more complicated. And smaller institutions, regional museums, university museums. And actually, if you start looking at the regional museums and the university museums, they've been very active. They've actually been on the vanguard of return and building relationships, which is really what the foundation for restitution is. So there's actually quite a lot that's happened even just in the last year or so. And I imagine that trend is going to continue. There will need to be some shifts from the larger national institutions, but we'll have to see how that plays out. But as I said, they have legal restrictions, and they'll have to think creatively to get around some of those.
Thank you very much. I'm very well aware it was an unfair question, but you did extremely well with it. And now I think we're ready for questions. Maria Perez, are there any questions?
Yeah, we have some questions from the audience. The first one I would like to address to Herekiekie, and it's related to whether there are already processes or dialogue between institutions in Europe and the South Pacific, and how these processes are being developed or being carried out.
Thank you for that question. It's a very interesting question and a very important question. So I can only answer it from a New Zealand perspective, because the Australians have their own program, and the other Pacific countries would have their own programs as well. So the engagement with us is from a national museum. So we're a national museum. We've been mandated by the New Zealand government, and we've also been supported by Māori and Moriori communities. So that gives us the access to engage in negotiations with institutions overseas. And really is that mandate is actually key for us, because it means we're recognised as someone, as I said, we're as a group with authority and mandate.
Thank you very much. My next question is maybe for Professor Hilgert, and it's related to the role of the German contact point and how the German contact point can support processes of return or restitution, or how can the contact point support countries and societies of origin and German institutions in these processes?
The contact point's mandate is to help everybody who's interested in the return of human remains to the country or society of origin. And that means providing information about who's responsible, who may be the owner legally speaking, but that also implies creating procedures, creating mechanisms for an effective return. We are a service point. We think of ourselves as a help desk for institutions, both abroad and in Germany, who are interested in the return and the restitution of cultural property and human remains from colonial contexts. And I think the big challenge will be to find good solutions to this challenge together with the societies and the countries of origin. I think we're the interface, we're the communication channel that societies and countries of origin can use to express their demands, their wishes, their claims.
Thank you very much, Professor Hilgert. Now I would like to ask Malick Ndiaye a question, also a question from the audience. From European museums or institutions, we often hear that there is no real demand from former colonies. Could you please comment on that, on the state of demands from African countries?
Can you repeat the question, because I don't understand so much?
The question is, from European museums, we often hear, that's a question from a European colleague as well. From European museums, we often hear that there are no demands for restitution from former colonies to European museums. Could you please comment on that?
I think that it is a strategy, because demands from African country was during the just after the independence, and since the independence to nowadays, we have many government who raise their voice to demand object. So I am not sure that maybe what we can say is that we don't have many in the proportionality of the country. We don't have many country who have an official demand of object, but we have some country that in the past and today also demand object. But now, since the speech of Macron, many countries began to set up some commission, commission about restitution, in order to learn what else about the collection and what happened about the object that was stolen, and where these objects are, in order to make official demand.
Thank you very much. So now processes are being set up, so to say, in African countries to carry out this process. Now maybe a question for Alexander Herman. A person from the audience asked whether we can talk about property. Moment. Yeah. Whether we can talk about property and legal acquisition when talking about objects from colonial contexts.
Well, I think a strict legal claim is very difficult in terms of the traditional way of going to court and bringing a civil claim for recovery. And I think that's why we have to move beyond the legal discussion towards an ethical discussion, which is, I think, what is being done in Germany at the contact point as well. So I think that the idea of an illegal acquisition that occurred, let's say 100 years ago, because of the restrictions on limitation periods and prescription periods in most countries, unfortunately, those claims probably would not succeed. And so I think sometimes that we need to accept that fact and move to the ethical plane from the legal one.
Thank you very much. And now maybe a last question for Professor De Castro. Someone from the audience is asking whether we are also considering the impacts these subjects have had in ecological museums in Germany during the past years. I mean, not only the impact this might have, these subjects might have when they are restituted or returned, but the impact these subjects have had for research and for the museum and for the societies here in Europe per se.
Sorry, I don't understand if the question means the impact of the objects for our public after the restitution. So
no, it says
no. So it's different. You cannot tell. There are some objects from the colonial with colonial contact that were very important for people, that played a crucial role also in. For example, for the diaspora communities, yeah, we were talking about creating identity. For sure, museums are places that construct and can create identity, but others were not so important. The Bible and the whip, for example, from Henrik Wittboy, did not play the crucial part. They were not exhibited, for example. They were sometimes they were exhibited in Berlin in the colonialism exhibition, but not in our museum. So they did not play a very important part, but you cannot tell this for every object. This is difficult.
Yeah, this was a very general question, whether there wasn't a sort of evaluation of the impact these objects have had in the German collections.
Okay, what I perhaps would like to say is that the entangled history is for us very important, and the objects also from Namibia or from Cameroon or wherever also tell us about German history and European history. Yeah, and so we should always look on both parts. Yeah, and they what kind of stories are we telling here, and decide together also on the narratives and on the impact of the objects on society.
Thank you very much, Professor De Castro. Thank you very much to all participants and to Professor Markus Hilgert for the moderation. We are now moving on to the next panel on international cooperation, and I'll hand it over to my colleague Leopold von Karlowitz. Thank you very much.